Welcome back. In this episode I'm going to begin nerd whispering Patriot Acts by Catherine Crier, because she obviously understands the importance of knowing where somebody is coming from so you can better understand and respect that person's perspective. She tells us a little about herself. I also Googled and got a little more information. By the way, I will be referring to her as Catherine throughout these videos, because I'm pretty sure she's not the kind of person to put on airs and demand to be called Ms. Crier. She was born in the mid-1950s in Dallas, Texas, and describes having a good middle-class upbringing with supportive parents. She spent a lot of time as a teenager horseback riding, cleaning stables, and competing in horse shows. Not a princessy kind of gal here. She says that she was given lots of freedom, but learned early on that with freedom comes responsibility. Like me, she was born when Dwight Eisenhower was president. Back then, the Republicans were visionaries, building, innovating, and investing in America's future. I know it must be hard for millennials and iGen kids to even imagine, but back when us boomers were kids, the Republican Party was dominated by Thomas Paine-style conservatives who valued national investment in science, technology, and infrastructure, not just military spending, corporate subsidies, and tax cuts for the rich. Catherine says, "Our public dollars were well spent creating platforms on which private enterprise could prosper." She immediately adds, "I understood that much had come my way through no effort on my part." She lists some of the advantages that she had and says, "Taking these circumstances for granted was unacceptable. In the United States, achievement was not measured by someone's station at birth or by bank accounts or social standing. Americans were judged on what they did, not who they were." This is the exact opposite of Edmund Burke type elitists who not only take for granted but feel entitled to wealth, power, and privilege based on their social standing. To kind of drive this point home, Catherine says that in her family, success and respect were earned through integrity and hard work. In the Crier household, this notion of American meritocracy was on regular display. Boom. She has quite a bit to say about learning moral and ethical responsibilities, patriotism over partisanship, and the importance of the teachings of Jesus. Rock on, Catherine. But I want to jump forward to when she graduated law school. She was hired right out of college by the Dallas County District Attorney's Office, the DA's office, as an assistant DA. She wound up becoming a felony chief prosecutor. But the important thing is, she says that at the DA's office, the Dallas DA's office was notoriously tough on crime, and she saw abuses of power that left a mark on her. She says that without an honest commitment to our system of justice, people can misuse their power. The ends do not justify the means, and how you play the game matters more than the score. In 1984, she ran for office as a district court judge. She left the DA's office with her ideals intact, but says that she had some skepticism about human nature. She said, "Our system of government was good. It was the people running it that need watching." She won election as a district court judge in 1984 and re-election in 1988. But she says, things shifted dramatically during the Reagan years. Republican attitudes and policies were increasingly harsh and authoritarian, exploiting cultural differences and financial inequities to serve powerful special interests. She said, I joined the ranks of those who declare, I didn't leave the party left me. Catherine says, today I'm part of the growing number of independents unable or unwilling to identify with either major party. Personally, I'd like to welcome Catherine into what I call the WTF majority. It's what nerds call the silent majority, but most of us are not silent at all. We look at the party on the left, party on the right, and say, what the F? Catherine, badass as she is, gives them a two-fisted sucker punch, saying, neither party honestly represents the intellectual tradition of their respective groups. Both parties have abandoned American interests in favor of a single global agenda, one that is devastating our citizens, threatening our national security, and corrupting our constitutional government. Catherine does not say in her book what she did later, but I think it's kind of important to add that in 1990 she became a television journalist at CNN. In '93 she jumped over to ABC News, where she won an Emmy Award for outstanding investigative journalism as a correspondent on their weekly news magazine show 2020, which is where I first saw her. She also was a substitute anchor on the evening news at ABC. In 1996, she jumped over to the then brand new Fox News Network, where she had a nightly show where she would interview the movers and shakers, makers and breakers of American society. I suspect that some of those elites got a little uncomfortable sitting in the crosshairs of a smart, competent former judge and prosecuting attorney, because by 1999 she was gone from Fox and working for a small cable channel, Court TV. While at Court TV, Catherine wrote several books, including The Case Against Lawyers, which I haven't read but want to. Maybe I'll nerd whisper it someday. I have read this one about a sociopath who murdered his pregnant wife. Catherine knows a little about sociopaths. She wrote a couple other books before Patriot Acts in 2011. Since then, she's been a managing partner at a media company. I took a lot more time than I ordinarily would introducing Catherine, because the point I want to make is that this is a smart, competent woman with guts and integrity and real-world accomplishments, not just credentials and three-word slogans. Now I can get started nerd whispering. Catherine begins chapter 1 pointing out that our founding fathers created a constitutional government based on a set of principles known as classical liberalism. If you're a conservative and you get your panties in a bunch just hearing a word with liberal in it, relax. That's because classical liberals are as different from today's lefty liberals as true American Thomas Paine-style conservatives are different from Edmund Burke-style rich elitist a-hole conservatives who only want to conserve their wealth, power, and privilege. Catherine explains that classical liberalism involves three things: individual liberty, private property, and representative democracy. Any conservatives got a problem with that? Don't think so. One thing that Catherine does not explain is that how those terms are interpreted can mean different things to different people. For example, our form of representative democracy would probably be unimaginable to our founding fathers. That's because what we have today is what I call that artificial political habitat that voters are guided into. Then they're guided toward one side or another, and then guided to behave like monkeys in a zoo, throwing poop at each other. It's still representative democracy, but what nerds call guided democracy, for obvious reasons. Getting back to her book, Catherine gives us a little history lesson on how during our Constitutional Convention in 1787, extremists on both the left and the right tried but failed to get their self-serving ideologies into our Constitution. Well, just because they failed doesn't mean that they would quit trying. And over nearly 200 years, both sides were successful to some degree or another in rigging the game in their favor. In the 1960s, a classical liberalism nerd by the name of Friedrich Hayek called out the corruption and abuse of power on both the left and the right. Catherine seems to have a higher opinion of Friedrich Hayek than I do, apparently seeing him as a true nerd. Hey, if anybody can point out to me anything that this guy ever figured out that made the world a better place for anybody, much less everybody, I would gladly reconsider my opinion. Him simply pointing out the corruption and abuse of power by these two parties, to me, falls into the category of, thank you very much, Captain Obvious. Speaking of obvious, I hope y'all didn't think it was just that simple. If you did, binary thinking strikes again. Although both Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke believed in classical liberalism, individual liberty, private property, and representative democracy, they actually represent two pretty extreme views within classical liberalism, with a big gray area in the middle between them, and socialism and fascism falling outside of that. Friedrich Hayek actually falls somewhere in the middle. He definitely hated both socialism and fascism. That much is absolutely certain. But whether he was closer to Thomas Paine or Edmund Burke is debatable. Regardless of where he falls on that spectrum, I totally agree with Catherine when she says the important thing that Hayek pointed out is that a lot of conservatives don't care about democracy anymore. Hayek essentially said, the conservative, like the socialist, regards himself as entitled to force the values he holds on other people. Catherine puts what he said in a nutshell, saying that their tendency is to challenge or ignore our most fundamental constitutional principles whenever they block what they want or permit what they don't want. Next, Catherine gives true believers in this party or that party a verbal spanking, pointing out that there ain't nothing patriotic about granting powers that exceed our Constitution to politicians just because you agree with their positions. She says, true patriots will oppose actions by either party that seek to thwart the democratic process or secure power that exceeds constitutional authority. Then she bitch slaps politicians on both sides who play on people's fear and anger to score points with their base, as well as news commentators who do the same thing for ratings. I love it when she points out that to those people, truth is not an obstacle, as they invent fantasy versions of our history and invent data out of thin air to justify their positions. I don't think Catherine could have imagined in 2011 when she wrote this just how much worse it would get. She does mention how lying Republicans claimed that Obama was a Muslim, but she had no way to know that in just 5 years, the Obama administration would launch an illegal, unconstitutional investigation into the Trump campaign, not to mention the whole Russiagate witch hunt. In the same way, she rips into Republicans who claim that liberals hate America, but had no way to know that in 5 years, liberals would be claiming that conservatives are racists and deplorables. The crucially important point that she makes here is that not just respecting, but defending the rights of our fellow Americans to have a different point of view is not just a matter of civility, not just a matter of being nice, but a requirement of democracy. Catherine ends off chapter 1 pointing out how both parties are willfully ignoring some of the greatest threats to our democratic process. She mentions the 2010 Citizens United decision, one of those decisions that gave corporations the same rights as American citizens, same rights as God's children. In case you didn't know, according to the Supreme Court, corporations have the right to spend as much money as they want on political campaigns because money equals free speech. She also talks a little about gerrymandering, the rigging of congressional districts to ensure that one party or the other will pretty much own a particular congressional district. I wish she had talked about how both parties work together to pretty much ensure that third party or independent candidates cannot be elected. Instead, she focuses in on her main point in her chapter 1 conclusion. To a true American patriot, our nation's founding principles are not negotiable. We the people need to collectively pull our heads out of our asses and see that whenever we stray from our principles for partisan advantage, we may help our party win, but we only end up screwing ourselves. Of course, Catherine worded her conclusion to chapter 1 a little more politely than that, but she was born into a nice family and raised in God's country, Texas, so I really can't blame her for that. In my next video, I'll launch right into chapter 2. See you then. If you like this video, why not click the like button? I'll put a link to the next episode over here.